Hello there, Minerva makers, it's Jo, and we are here with our third episode of Back to Basics Learn to Sew. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at how to cut fabric. In episode 1, we looked at the kit that you need to learn to sew. Last episode, we looked at how to choose fabrics that are easy for new sewers to get along with and to get started. And today we're looking at how to cut out that fabric. So we need to look at our fabric that comes in the post and we get all excited about it, but you can't cut out straight away. It's a good idea to get yourself into the habit of pre-washing your fabric. Now, when you're just making a small tote bag or something as a beginner, you might think it's not really very important, but it's a really good habit to have. When your fabric comes, take the card label off. You could even write on it what it is so that you don't forget. And you need to put your fabric through the wash. This has been through the wash at 40 degrees. It's a cotton ticking, so I know that sort of stable cotton can take a good 40-degree wash, and then whatever I make with this item will not shrink after I've made it. I'm going to make a cushion cover with it, so I wouldn't like to spend some time making the cushion cover and then on the first time I wash it, it goes too small and the cushion doesn't fit inside. You can see that if you get this habit early on, then that won't happen when you make clothes further down the line, because you wouldn't want to fit all of a dress or a top or sleeves to then find that after the first wash it's too small. You can also tumble dry your fabric as well if that's how you're going to treat it after you've made your garment or project. So it's a good idea, if you're going to make something that you wash and tumble dry and wear all the time, that you make sure that you treat it the same before you make your garment so that afterwards you don't have any nasty surprises. As part of your pre-wash process, it's also a good idea to iron your fabric, because if it's got bumps and wrinkles and quite deep press marks in it where it's been folded for a while maybe, then your cutting out won't be so accurate, because when that little bump relaxes flat, you'll get another millimetre here and another millimetre there. I must admit I'm really bad at that. I need to do it more. I need to make sure that I press my fabric before I put my pattern pieces on. I guess one of the most frightening things about learning to sew is actually cutting the fabric, because there's lots of things you can undo as a sewer. You can unpin something and try it again. You can unpick something and sew it again. But once you've cut something, you've cut it. And that sometimes makes people a little bit frightened of getting started. But really, it's just fabric. You might make mistakes, but you probably won't make them again once you've made them once. So you can always try out on some spare fabric, on a recycled piece of fabric, to get some practice on how to use your scissors or how to sew under your sewing machine, so you don't have to use your bought fabric just for trying out. When you think you're ready to cut and you've got your sewing machine all set up ready, then you can cut your real fabric with just a few simple tips. We're going to head over to my kitchen table so that we can cut the fabric. I want you to learn a couple of things. I want you to find out what selvedge is. I want you to find a little bit out about grainline, because although your first projects might not need so much importance on the grainline, it's a really good thing to understand right from the start. I wish that I understood right from the start of sewing what grainline meant, because some things would have sewn better, they would have gone together better, they would have hung better when they were finished, but I just put everything as economically as I could onto a piece of fabric, and that's not the best way to cut out fabric. I'm going to show you how to cut out fabric in a single layer, and also what to do if you need to fold your fabric in half to get a double layer so that you get two pieces. In this case it's a symmetrical piece, but sometimes you fold the fabric in half so that you get two mirrored pieces. All you need for cutting out is your pin tin and your scissors and maybe a tape measure. A few tips for cutting out. It's not always possible, but try and have all of your fabric on the table. So even if you can't fit all of your pieces onto the length of fabric, have the fabric up on the table so that you use the first part, move it along, keep that on the table, and then use the next part. If it's draping off a table, then you're putting the fabric under an element of stretch or tension. So when you cut it, it sort of pings back, a bit like when you cut a child's fringe when it's wet and then when it's dry it pings up in the air. So you need to make sure that everything is flat on the table or on the floor if you need to cut out on the floor. It's tricky, everyone's got different sewing spaces, but keep it as flat as you can so that the fabric isn't under any tension. Okay, let's look at cutting out our fabric. So this is the ticking fabric. I'm not going to make rules, but I'm going to give you some suggestions. It's quite often a good idea to cut out with the wrong side of the fabric facing up. So this is the wrong side of the fabric. This is the right side of the fabric with a more vibrant colour print on it. And the reason I want to cut from the wrong side of the fabric is because I'm going to mark it with one of my tools. So I can either use the air erasable pen or my chalk pen. And I don't really want that mark on the right side, so I'm going to keep all my markings on the wrong side of the fabric. And that's the same if you're cutting out garments for yourself to wear. Let's take a look at what the fabric looks like. So along one side of your fabric you'll have a selvage, and that's the edge of the fabric. It's a little bit tighter than the rest of the fabric. It's not true to the actual fabric composition, and it's where all the threads are finished off at the machine process. And you need to know where they are, because when you cut your fabric you'll want to put the selvages together. So you put the selvage from one side to the other side, and it's your first understanding of the grain line of fabric. When you put the selvages together, here and here, then the fabric running in the direction parallel to the selvage is called the straight grain. And the straight grain is very, very stable. It's the warps of the fabric weave. So the warps run this way and they're really strong. Going across the fabric is the cross grain, and the cross grain has a little bit more give. Not in ticking so much because it's a very stable fabric all round, but so across here your fabric has a bit more give, and sometimes you might want that if you're cutting something that's going around your hips, around your shoulders, around your bust, around your arms. So even though you're not working at that sort of level at the moment, if you're beginning to sew, it's good to start off in the right way so that it becomes second nature when you're cutting out other items. So put the selvage to the selvage, fold your fabric in half if you're cutting two of things, and cut out on the wrong side. Just to show you some tips, I'm going to cut out a square of fabric. So I've got the selvage here, which means I'm going to take a straight line parallel to the selvage. So I know that that's straight because that's on the selvage edge. I can pull a thread out of this fabric, a weft thread, and if I pull this thread out, then that's giving me a straight line along this plane. And I'm going to measure across here. I'm going to use my tape measure. And I want this line to be 37 centimetres. Because I want this to be square, I'm going to mark 37 centimetres all the way along, so that my line doesn't drift in or out. I'd like to cut this square out now, so I'm going to use my dressmaking scissors, and the big one goes on the bottom with your fingers in, and I'd like to cut it so that the fabric that I'm cutting is on the right. I'm right-handed, so I'd like my scissors to be cutting with the fabric on the right. If you do small snipping ones, you get a bit of a feathered edge. that's not so tidy. So if you can take long strokes, you'll get straighter lines. If you need to cut something out on double the fabric because you need two identical pieces of something, then you're going to fold the fabric so that you've got the wrong side again. And it's quite easy with this one because I can match up the stripes along the bottom, but I'm still wanting that straight grain to be running straight and the cross grain to be running across. If you're using pattern pieces instead of just measuring and cutting out a flat piece, then this is where you will need to use your pins. Place your pattern piece onto the fabric. I'm still using this selvedge. I don't want to use it for my sewing because it's a different type of fabric. It's bound differently. And I'm going to put my pattern piece onto the fabric and I'm going to pin it in the corners. You pin going out to the corners, then that holds that down. Getting a little bit of curling. You don't need to pin it all the way around like you would if you were sewing. You just need to get down the main corners and edges. Next, we're going to cut this out, and this is where I really want to show you how cutting with your item on the right hand side of your right-handed scissors becomes good, because it makes your cutting more accurate. So I'm going to take those long strokes again, and I'm going to make sure my paper pieces are on the right of my scissors, because then when I put my blade underneath, I'm lifting everything up together. I'm lifting the fabric nearer to the paper pattern piece, and I'm getting a really accurate cut. If I cut with the pattern on my left, what happens is when I put the blade underneath and I start cutting, what happens is the paper and the fabric separate, so I can only really but guess where the line is there. My strokes have gone smaller already because I'm feeling more tentative about where the actual sewing line is. So when I lift it up, especially if you haven't got enough pins in, when you lift it up, there gets a gap between the paper and the fabric, and I lose the sort of sandwich effect of it all staying nice and close together. So it's best, if you're right-handed, to keep all of your paper and pattern on the right. Obviously it's vice versa if you're left-handed, and to achieve that you're going to need to keep turning your work around, which doesn't always happen if you're cutting out on the floor or on carpet. You tend to have to move yourself around. So that is how to cut out with a pattern piece. Take the pins out. You might want to mark the top, the bottom, if you've got any special features on the top or the bottom of your fabric. This is the right side. I cut out from the wrong side. I hope today's episode has given you a little bit of confidence to cut out some fabric. Maybe you've been hoarding one for a while and you've been a little bit frightened to cut it. Just make sure that you take your time with the cutting part of the process. We sometimes rush it to get on to sew, but actually if it's cut really well in the first place, then the sewing process will become much easier. Use your sharp scissors, put them away afterwards so they don't get used for anything else, and make sure that all of your fabric is flat on an area that won't mean that it's slopping around or moving. We would love you to carry on joining us through these Back to Basic episodes. We're on episode 3. Next time on episode 4, we're going to take a look at threading up your sewing machine and setting it up. I think that's quite important. That's another area that people are quite low on confidence, especially if you've been given the machine or you've had the machine for ages and you haven't got it up and running. So next time we're on episode 4, setting up your sewing machine. In the meantime, do head over to Minerva and take a look at our Minerva Makers inspirational makes, or the products and promotions that we've got on at the moment. Thanks very much for watching. See you again soon.